Okay, good evening, buonasera to everybody here. Thank you to Rizzoli for having us. Really pleased to be here with Brian tonight to talk about, to celebrate this new translation of Lalla Romano. We thought we would start off with a bit of reading to give you a taste of her work and of this particular work we're going to focus on tonight. So just to give you some context, if you are not familiar with the author, Lalla Romano was born in 1906 in the Piedmont region of Italy, in the mountains. She was a lover of the mountains, a climber of the mountains. The mountains figure frequently in her work as a setting, as a symbol, as a spiritual calling, shall we say. She went to Turin for university. She studied painting and wrote poetry, and then she translated some stories by Flaubert into Italian, and she describes this experience of translating Flaubert's work as what sort of inspires her to become a prose writer. And so she also begins to write novels and published a great number of novels. The novel we're going to talk about tonight, In Farthest Seas, was called originally, this is the Italian edition, Nei Mari Estremi, and she wrote this in 1980s, well, it was published in 1987. This was just 3 years after she lost her companion of around, or perhaps more than 50 years, a man named Innocenzo Monti. And this novel describes her meeting Innocenzo and her losing Innocenzo. This comes out some years after, almost 20 years after she wins the Strega Prize, Italy's most prestigious literary prize. And so she really achieved great things in her lifetime in terms of her production. But that said, she is not sort of at the center of the literary landscape in Italy, and never really was, and perhaps part of her aura, shall we say, was a kind of private one in many ways. And this book is a very private work, I would say, a deeply private work, and yet she wrote it, and she meant for it to be published, very much meant for it to be published. So that's a little bit of context about the work. We could say a lot more, I could say a lot more, but just to get us started, and Brian's going to read a little bit from the translation.
Okay, so thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jhumpa, for that lovely intro, and just for being here. You know, it's very exciting. So I'll just read to get us right into the book. I'll say briefly that this book, which is, of course, as Jhumpa was saying, about her relationship with her husband of 50 years, their life together, and then his passing, ultimately, is divided into two parts. The first half is titled 4 Years. This details the first 4 years in which their relationship really starts. It starts when in the mountains outside the home province of Cuneo, the farthest westernmost part of Italy, northern Italy towards France, on these adventurous alpine excursions and hikes, and eventually ends that section with them getting married. The second section is called 4 Months. After the 4 years, 4 months, and that's his rapid decline and ultimately death. I'll read from a section after they have met, but before the relationship has really started. And there's a little reference to a previous mountain that on which they've climbed called the Mea, That's the only really reference you need to understand. I was crossing the piazza alone, and I saw him from afar with someone. When I was a few paces from him, he broke away and came towards me. He said that they would be going, he and Gigi, to the Pagari if I wanted to join them. It was even better than a declaration of love. I was considered equal, and surely they hadn't forgotten that I was a woman. It had already happened for the Maya, but this time, whose idea had it been? The Pagari Refuge, legendary to us all, was a tiny cabin at a 3,000-meter altitude, held there with steel cables. You mountaineers in the Maritime Alps put your cabins up on the peaks, the great Metzalama once said. It was November. We needed to light the wood stove. He chopped wood in a little clearing and grew warm from this exertion, so that despite the cold, his shirt gleamed white in the twilight. There was something at once adventurous, exotic, in the sense of faraway countries, and intimate in that image, as though already lived or dreamed. It matched, or rather expressed, all the risk and mystery there was in that cold light, in that solitude. In the stories by Lawrence that I had just read, I had found this. And for a moment, I felt an attraction for him that was violent, secret, but I believe already tenaciously deep. It wasn't an idea, it was a sensation, head-spinning, but not unsettling, rather familiar. That night, each bundled up in thorny military blankets like 3 giant newborns or dead sailors about to be lowered into the sea, we lay in a row, I in the middle, on the higher floor, I suppose to receive a little residual warmth. From a small window, some feeble light entered. In the wild wind, the walls, the steel cables, everything vibrated, whistled, hissed. Motionless on their backs, my 2 companions had their wool brims lowered all the way down to their noses and were sleeping, or were pretending to. In the glimmering trail of light, I could make out his profile, which looked funny to me. I laughed silently to myself. I was, who knows why, happy. I liked this section at the beginning of the book because, this is a story of an ultimate journey in the end, an ultimate adventure, we could even say, though a morbid one in the most literal sense of the word. But their relationship starts with these literal journeys into the mountains, which are spiritualized throughout her writing of the process. Throughout the work, she finds these repetitions, these returns, she calls them. And so in the beginning of their life together, she finds almost premonitions for their future and even for his death eventually. So the mountains are very key. And since Lalla was a painter, these moments, almost these revelations of attraction, where she sees her husband Innocenzo chopping wood, she freezes time almost. It becomes painterly, and not in a literal descriptive sense, but in an emotional sense, how she freezes time, and it's there that she realizes how attracted she is to Innocenzo, not just physically, but on an emotive level. And throughout the book, she'll think back on this image as an image of the wildlife. And throughout the writing of their life her writing of their life together, she'll question, did I have it, the wildlife? The one I dreamed of when I saw him chopping wood at the Pagari Refuge. And that's something that we can maybe return to throughout our conversation. But I will just note that it's worth repeating that this is around 1929 in fascist Italy. This is a very young woman going on a mountain hike, staying overnight in an isolated cabin with two men. Lalla was a tough cookie. I don't know what the expression is, something like that. I mean, she really was, she was bold in her writing, but she was also always very bold in her life, and I think that's worth considering from the get-go.
Absolutely, and I just, I'll reread what you read. It was when she's invited to go with them. It was even better than a declaration of love. I was considered equal. So this proposal to go up the mountain with these men, given the times, given the context, is really extraordinary. And just to pick up on what you were saying about her painterly dimension and training. So I think that one of the things that struck me when I discovered Lalla Romano's work was the way in which she really cast back, reversed, toppled the male gaze. She was a woman who painted men, painted them in words, painted them on canvas as well. But I think many of her works are portraits of men. I have had a very limited experience of translating Lalla Romano's work as well. I put one of her stories in this anthology of Italian writers that I edited some years ago. I put in a story called The Lady, La Signora in Italian. And it actually has an interesting echo with this novel, because the beginning of the story is a woman looking at a man and commenting on his hands and deciding that they're perfect. So it's kind of this, she really, takes it upon herself to have also pronounce aesthetic judgment on the male body. I don't think anybody was doing this at all in literature anywhere, but certainly not in Italy. Because this novel, In Farthest Seas, also starts out the very first fragment, if you will. I mean, they're not really fragments, but the book is composed in a sort of mosaic-like way. Some chapters are very short, some chapters are short-ish, none are terribly long, but she herself describes the writing of the book as an accumulation. And so, and the effect of reading it is also one of accumulating intensity. But this novel also starts off talking about looking, the gaze again, looking at Innocenzo. I'll just read briefly. Sylvia is her sister. It was Sylvia, she had discovered him before I did, him, who told me, look at his hands while he talks. And then there's a description of him, very visual, very precise, of this man who is unnamed, but she's clearly attracted to him to the degree to which she is now capturing him in some sense in words. But I think it's not simply, we can't simply reduce the book to a portrait of Innocenzo, because it's also very much a portrait of the couple, and it's also very much a portrait of what happens when she becomes a widow. It's all three things. And I think that's one of the most extraordinary feats that she pulls off, is that it's both, it's the account of a love story, the unfolding of a love story, the unraveling of a life together, and the fact that she does go on and she does live on. I think it's very layered in this way. And I wondered, as you were translating, I mean, did you feel that you were shifting as you were translating in terms of how much energy she was putting into the recreation of the past and the marriage and the relationship, because she really rebuilds it, right? Perhaps for herself as well as for her reader. But then there are moments of intense interiority just about her, right? And in fact, that word I think is relevant too, because she calls her whole project an interior, what does she call it, an interior history, right? Which, you know, we can say, well, women aren't really or weren't really part of official history, so they had to have these alternative histories, interior histories, diaries, you know, where do we learn about women's lives, women's experiences? And the book certainly has a very private, diaristic quality. I would say that I find fascinating, but as you say, she liked to turn the tables, right? Could you talk a little bit about sort of how she wove between that private mode and the very declarative, open
Yes.
mode of writing?
Yes, well, I mean, she's such an interesting case, and maybe I'll take a step back first and place this a bit more in her broader body of work, because she really did, she hardly ever strayed from what we would call, and what she would call also autobiographical material, though she hated the term autobiography. And this, after her first collection of dreams, essentially, her first story collection in prose, but all dreams, she increasingly just wrote from her own perspective on the relationships and periods that had touched her the most. And that often involved family members. The thing is that ultimately, these books all come together to offer a complete depiction of a life like none other that I know personally in 20th century literature. Certainly not in Italian literature. She's in many ways a forerunner to the way people conceive of the work of an author like Annie Ernaux, with all of these individual memoirs, which come together to offer a full tapestry, of these various periods of her life. Romano did that, and she didn't do it in a way at least to read her and to read her essays and interviews. She didn't do it in a way that was self-conscious. She simply did not see a difference in literature between what we might call fiction and fact. She was drawn to write about these things in her life, and she did not think it made a difference. She said that, for me, memory coincides with invention. On a certain level, there was no real distinction between, okay, I'm writing about my private life, or I'm going to write about something made up. She did not believe there was a difference. But the reality is that this often came at huge personal sacrifice. It was not an easy or indifferent choice. The most extreme example would have been her Strega Prize-winning novel, Le parole tra noi leggere, which could be translated as Light Words Between Us, which focuses on her very difficult relationship with her son. It stems from a deep love for this character. It's an almost obsessive love to try to figure him out, but it's also figuring out what is it that does not, why are we at odds with each other? She then later said that he actually found the book kind of funny, but then when it won the Strega Prize and became a bestseller, this was just too much a burden for him, and their relationship deteriorated to the point of reaching a breaking point. So she took incredible risks and made incredible sacrifices in order to bring the reader into her private life, to let her private life be public. She simply saw it as a necessity. She had to write about what she was called to write about, and she was called to write about what had touched her the most in her life. In terms of that, it's a very interesting line that you bring up, where she says, she mentions 2 dates. She says the 8th and the 9th, which were 2 public holidays then, are one of the few dates in my interior history almost completely devoid of chronological artifacts, I believe, more or less. She wrote that when she was young, she regretted the fact that she actually thought she had a poor memory. And later in life, she realized that was actually an advantage for her art, because memory was already the first choice. Memory was choosing for her what the salient moments were, what the salient connections were. And that is something that I believe in this book, more than any other work, we feel again and again on the page. These revelatory moments are truly bubbling up to the surface. And that is, I guess, is my answer to the original question. When she's sliding, navigating these various moments, because it's the far distant past, it's her life at the very beginning with Innocenzo, which at that point was 50 years earlier. It's their whole life together through that 50 years, because she really does find the essence of him as a character and their time together. And then those 4 months, his death, and her as a widow. But every moment when she is navigating these various phases are alive in that moment.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, there's such immediacy in the book, and it almost feels as if you are sitting next to her as she's writing it. I mean, there seems to be very little of that distance that we feel at times when we read novels, and and I'm so interested in her ability also to sort of issue these sort of the categories that confine us, so many of us, between sort of what is real, what is invented, what is fiction, what is fact, memory. And of course now we live in a world where we have new words and autofiction and all sorts of different, yet more categories to describe what writers have always done. But I wonder, I mean, it occurred to me as you were speaking, I wonder how much her training as a painter perhaps conditioned her to be able to write what she knew, what she saw, what she felt, and realize that it was always an interpretation and an invention in some sense, because that's what a visual artist is doing, right? I mean, even if I'm going to paint this chair right in front of me, it's not going to be the chair, right? It's going to be my painting of the chair, even though the chair really does exist, right? And then somehow in the making of that painting, I unmake the chair, or I remake the chair, or however you want to think of it. But I wonder if that prior formation enables her to think about writing already liberated from sort of, what is it that I'm writing and what box is it going to go into? And I do feel that, one of the things I find so exciting about her work is that it really sort of skirts categories. The first book, which is called the Metamorphoses, after Ovid's masterpiece, is a collection of dreams that are very disturbing, very unsettling, very specific. But one could call it a dream diary, but it's not, because it's actually, highly embroidered, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but interestingly embroidered with, her own interpretations in a lucid state of the dreams.
And some
right?
of them are portraits of other people via their dreams.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you had translating this novel and translating Lalla Romano in general? Anything about her language, her register, anything that comes to mind?
Certainly, and you've mentioned this a bit, I mean, the chapters are brief, and everything, it's very essential, spare, but impactful prose. I was coming to her, I had gone back and forth, but I came back to this book after doing very, very hyper-stylized works from Italian, from one author, intentionally so. The first thing I was feeling with this book again is there's truly nowhere to hide. Every single word has to be right, and every comma has to be right, because it has that kind of essential quality to it, but it goes beyond that, because it's not to say it's just a minimalist style. I mean, she is an incredible stylist. I think she is one of the great stylists of Italian literature, only that it's rather hidden because it's not ornamental. But it is very musical and very rhythmic in very particular ways. It is not at all like spoken Italian, where it verges on spoken Italian. She says in her afterword that she was kind of a motivating force for kind of these questions and answers to myself. You can hear a voice, but it's such an interior voice that you have to respect that. You have to respect the particular nature of it. So it creates strange rhythms in Italian. I would call them strange sometimes. That when you're translating, you will feel the urge to, straighten it out. Like, put the sentence in order, right? That is always the biggest urge and sometimes necessity when translating Italian, which is very flexible in how you can order sentences, to English. Put it in the right order. That's what every editor and copy editor wants you to do. I was realizing more and more that Lalla had this musicality, this rhythm, that had to be maintained. It was not one for one, it had to be found in English. And she said that the enchantment of a book is born out of its rhythm. And in its rhythm is found its mystery.
Well, she's very musical, I agree. I mean, in addition to the visual, modality that she brings to the page. Can you tell us a little bit about the choice of the title, which again in Italian is Nei mari estremi, so in extreme seas. And in fact, she talks about the origin of the title of the book. I'll just read that little bit. So the book is full of reflections on art, on artists, on Rembrandt, on Modigliani, on Klimt, also on works of literature. Innocenzo they were both incredibly literary people. They read passionately, they went to the mountains, they talked about what they were reading. This was very much part of their relationship. But I'll just read this little bit from, or if you want to read it.
No, please do.
Okay? Yeah. This is from chapter 51 in the second part. I've had 2 framed images in my study for years. None of the Reuter in part because I frequently saw it again. But these have the same meaning and function. I cut one out from a newspaper. It's a landscape. I don't think I have to say symbolic, but real, of a beyond. It's a split iceberg. A ship passes between the 2 walls of ice, as though through a valley. I've always called it, quote, In Farthest Seas. So that is what gives rise to the title, this clipping, basically, of an image that strikes her, a visual image of an iceberg, which we could think of as a kind of a mountain, not exactly, but a mountainous thing, piece of landscape. And that's what gives her the title of this book, and in Italian. And it resonates because I do think we can think of Lalla as an extreme writer in many ways. I mean, she was extreme in her vision, she was extreme in her rigor, she was extreme in her choices, she was willing to write this very controversial book about her relationship with her son, which ended in, basically a break in their relationship. She was extreme in her ability to tirare fuori, right? Like bring out this very private material, intimate material, and there are passages that are quite kind of sexually frank in the book as well. So tell me about why you landed on farthest, which in English gives us the sense of distance, and of course distance is a huge theme in the book because she's looking back in in her 80s at her teenage years and forward. So there's a distance. There's the complication of distance, the distance imposed by time, all of the time that has passed. And then I think it's also very resonant because of the mountaineering sort of current of all of these hikes, all of these walks, all of these journeys, going to far places, going to, I'm not a mountaineer, but I've been to the mountains. I've been with people who are obsessed about mountain climbing, and part of the thrill of it is going on those hikes that no one else have been on, or you've never been on, and sort of this sense of exploration with each climb. So can you tell us about, were you considering other titles, or was this always the title you had?
Yes, well, sure. And I forgot, we have, from the first reading, this is Lalla with Innocenzo on the right there, and the other companion, Gigi, on the left. So this is from that hike at the beginning, they're from one of those excursions. So you're right, the question, whether extreme, right, because, so nei mari estremi, we hear extreme. But, so we went with, I personally thought that it was better in Farthest Seas on a number of levels. Well, the original is doing different things, right? So on a literal level, there is extreme is in extremity. That is what the literal meaning is. She originally heard it from an Anderson story, which in English has not been translated as, I believe, in the uttermost parts of the sea. And it is this idea that it's the farthest limits of the sea.
Which is also a metaphor for death.
Yes,
right?
Exactly, yeah. And that originally comes from the Bible verse. So there's a literal sense and there's very much a figurative sense. And for her, the figurative sense was very important too. And the imagery was important too, what it calls to mind. There was no getting beyond for me. Well, one, I don't believe that the literal sense is expressed to Anglophones when they hear extreme seas. I don't believe literally the idea of extremity, as in the farthest point, is communicated. So that's one thing missing. I also did not believe that the figurative sense, the emotive element was right, because I think it sounds like an action film in extreme seas.
Right.
But this was whereas there is something that I can't put in words, which I think is naturally mournful about In Farthest Seas. And she writes about death as not always just as a direct loss, but she writes about it as moving off. She realizes that it's traveling into the distance. It is not just a light switch, that goes on and off. It's actually this journey, as the passage you read, through the iceberg, through the farthest seas. Titles are hard, but it was the best.
I think it's beautiful. I think it's absolutely the right
I was scared to ask you, but if you don't mind me asking you, I've always followed with great interest your passion for Romano, and prior to, I'm sure that most readers and people who followed your work would have spotted it through your collection of Italian short stories. Since I was living in Italy at the time, prior to that, and when you had begun to write in Italian, I had the fortune of reading even earlier interviews when quite surprising, because as you said, she has now there's a bit of a resurgence. She had been a bit forgotten though when this was happening. How you immediately gravitated towards her, as at least so it seemed to me from the outside, when you were beginning to live in Italy, beginning to write in Italian, and I'm just so curious about what it was, and what kind of effect it had on your writing too, if you'd like to speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, she was when I first moved to Italy and began to write in Italian. That was I too was on a strange hike to a place I didn't know where I was going and where it would take me. It felt extreme. What I was doing felt quite extreme, and sort of on the edge, right, of quite precarious. And so I discovered her totally by chance. I was reading La Stampa. I found an article, a review. I think I found a review of one of her books, and I was very intrigued. It might have been this one. It might have been in Maria Estreni. It was an article written by Paolo Di Paolo, who is a very well-known writer in Italy. I'm sure he's been in this room before to talk about things during the Multipli Forti festivals. In any case, I knew Paolo, and because what I did, I read the article, and like Lalla Romano, I cut it out, and I went to the bookstores and I said, you know, I'm looking for this book, I'm looking for anything by this author, and I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find a single thing. This was in Rome, and I was, you know, making a concerted effort to find her work. And so then I wrote to Paolo, and I said, you know, I read this article, I'd really like to read her work, I can't find it, can you help me? And he said, oh, well, I know Antonio, her companion, Antonio Ria, after Innocenzo, she lived with this photographer, friend, who became her companion. And he very kindly, very generously sent me a big bundle of her work. A lot of out-of-print stuff. I mean, it was almost all out of print, literally everything. I mean, she's still almost entirely out of print in Italy. It depends. Like, little things get reissued, you know, the Le Metamorfosi, I remember buying.
They're going to, Einaudi, though, has decided they're going to.
Okay, well, good for Einaudi. Thank you, Einaudi. No, that's great. But it was, this, I'm talking about 15 years ago, or less than 15 years ago. She was very under the radar. I couldn't find her work. I had to make a concerted effort. I think this was this novel was one of the first things I read by her. And it really just knocked me off my feet. I found it such a modernist work in its spirit. You know, just incredible control and power, and I felt that it was, you know, a kind of harbinger of so many, works that then became incredibly well known in the Anglosphere, like Joan Didion's book about losing her husband, or Joyce Carol Oates, or Julian Barnes. You know, not just women, people, writers writing about losing, you know, their partners, long-term companions. This whole kind of genre, if you will. And I was really amazed that she had written this book in such an interesting style, and then I started reading more of her work, and then one of the things I discovered, I remember reading it on a train, coming back from Milano, and maybe I had also the opportunity to go to her house, and see her paintings and her books and things like that. But you know, toward the end of her life, she was nearly blind, and she continued daily she had a practice of, and I saw these huge kind of sketchbook notebooks, if you will, and she sat down and she wrote something every day. Sometimes it was just a word, sometimes it was a sentence, sometimes, a list or something like that, and the handwriting was very large, and you could see the effort that it was taking her to make these, to produce this form of writing, this final form of writing, if you will, and at one point she writes in the diary, la mia cecità è un equal sign uguale un punto di vista, which means my blindness is a point of view. And I thought, oh my God, this is really speaking to me, because I was feeling kind of semi-blind as I was learning to write in Italian, and I realized that I could look at it differently. I could look at the limitation as a point of view, as something that was of some value and not just something that was hindering me. And so I was really influenced by her, and I not just because of that fragment, but also because of her style of writing. And in fact, even the novel I'm working on right now, I'm thinking about structure, and I'm thinking about how to structure it, and I keep thinking about this novel and how she works with these kind of units of memory and invention, and how, you know, how they're stitched together.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Well, so does it have an autobiographical dimension? I mean, in a literal sense, in the way that hers does.
I mean,
it's hard not to ask the question when you're talking about Lalla Romano.
Yeah,
So,
no, I mean, yeah, I think most writing does,
yes.
really, and I think I think some writers are more honest about it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, really, that's what I feel. But I also have been interested in sort of the diary form and other elements. So anyway,
and that is one of, I mean, that it always seems on the verge of slipping into diary, this book, and it's in a way, it's the work of great artistry that she manages to do that, because what it is that it's creating such a sense of intimacy between you as reader and her. And one thing that was difficult in the translation that I guess I should have mentioned to your question before was, you know, there are references. There are references to people,
to her own work,
previous work, her work, which her work, early work, almost seems like, again, like premonitions. She's seeing her work as almost as signs of her life to come with Innocenzo and eventually his death. But and from the first page you read, and you said her sister, you know, you explained, which as right when reading aloud to an audience, she says it was Sylvia, you know. And sometimes in translation there's an urge to gloss, to kind of explain within the translation. I've done it any number of times depending on what the subject at hand is. And this is definitely a book where you could have done that more, but I realized it would have really thrown off that sense of true immediacy, you know, questions and answers to myself. You know, why would she ever say my sister? Sylvia is Sylvia, you know. And to even add those two words, as in many other cases, would have thrown off that sense of privacy, of intimacy, of slowly entering her head.
The accumulation element, yeah,
And
which I think is really, you know, the key that she herself says, is the idea of accumulation of meaning. And I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to, you know, acknowledge, and this is a really beautiful translation, and we're so lucky to have Brian Robert Moore translating Lalla Romano's work, and I hope that, you know, I mean, she deserves a much wider audience, both in Italy and in the English language. So really thank you for rewriting her so beautifully in English. But I also want to acknowledge, I hope you'll all get a copy of the book and read it, and you will be immersed, and you will not forget reading this book. I mean, it creeps up in a way that is, I mean, I've read it a number of times, and I read the translation recently, because it is recent, but I was again undone by the power of it, toward, you know, by the end. But I just also want to acknowledge that Brian has put together these amazing, erudite, thoughtful notes at the back that do not skip them. They're really lovely and informative and beautifully expressed. They don't feel stuffy or scholarly or any. I mean, they just add this lovely layer to the experience of reading the book, because I think what happens is you read the book and you're sort of hanging, and you want to keep, you know, I wanted at least to continue to know things and to learn things. So I really admired that. I wonder, I think we maybe have to end or open to questions. We don't have that much time. Do you know what time it is?
I think it's
Where is that? Yes, yeah. I'm here, I'm seeing, yes, time for questions sign.
I'll just throw out one last line about not, so here's some extra pictures. On the topic of endnotes, it became a slightly, they're not too many pages, but it did become a bit of an obsessive task. And once I started finding out who most people were in the book, I kind of wanted to find out who everyone is in the book. And that led to tracking down some relatives who had some beautiful photo albums of Lalla, with old pictures that I'd never seen before throughout the years. And here they are in the mountains.
Lovely.
And
do you have a picture of one of her paintings?
Yes, we have. So here we have a severe self-portrait. She from 1940, and she was very beautiful, especially in her youth. But in her youth, when she was really active as a painter, she wanted to hide that. And again, this is for social dynamics. She wanted to be taken seriously as an artist and as intellectually taken serious on an interpersonal level. So even in her work, this severity is clear. They're not necessarily, they're not looking for beauty.
And yet she's so sensitive to the beauty
of others.
Of others, and especially of men.
Yes.
Yeah.
And here, this is actually her painting now, in the early 20s. And these are all of Innocenzo from the 30s. This is from 1932, actually, the year that they were married. The larger one, yeah. And this is one from when he was sick, which she writes about in the book, and he starts to let his facial hair grow out, and she writes how she found him so beautiful that she kept drawing pictures of him in profile. The last thing I'll say about the endnotes was that in terms of these references, in the manuscripts, there was one line on a single page, just one line written with a typewriter that did not end up in the book, where she wrote, "Ho l'impressione, l'intuizione che siamo noi i fantasmi, lui invece vero." I have the intuition that we are the ghosts. He, on the other hand, or rather, is real. And that was something, these presences, everyone populating their life in this book, yes, they're almost these ghostly presences. As the book continues, it truly is him who becomes real. So that was something I also wanted to honor in the translation.
Yes, and beautifully so. But that is art, right? I mean, it's the making real of something, because we are all not.
Yeah.
We are all passing in a phantom-like way. But it's the one who stops, the artist who stops time, as she says, and makes the work and paints the portrait, whether on canvas or in a text that makes something real. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions for Ryan? Yes?
Yes. Well, thank you both for this beautiful and illuminating conversation. I have a translator question. I'm wondering if there are any sentences, if you can identify one of those sentences that you felt you had to leave in a kind of, in the order that perhaps English didn't call for. Is there anyone you can identify and read to us? Do you remember?
I had to leave. Oh, okay. Well, I wouldn't say I mean, you have to find an in between. It could never really sound wrong in English, but sometimes you had to push it a little bit. There was one I could never. So I remember this one comes to mind because I remember disagreeing with the copy editor. Like, she's told, she just gets told from the doctor how much time, and he says a few weeks. And then she says, in that moment, everything went dark. And she said suddenly how, she's reflecting on how suddenly there was no time left. And she says, like a person plummeting who sees moving towards her the ground where she'll be crushed. And I knew the sentence had to end with crushed. It needed to end on that. I needed to get there, and you needed to feel that impact. Suddenly, the book sometimes feels almost frozen in time as we're seeing, these painterly moments. But then there are these moments where it crashes. So that was a moment I remember saying, like, it has to move down. We have to fall with her. And there are all of these moments where suddenly, you'll sink into these romantic moments, and that mournful nature will just suddenly again bubble up. And those were often the hardest, and but they were also in many cases the most engaging. So I kind of had to just feel where the emotions were and trust my gut, as any translator would in those cases. And there were just moments that would leave me speechless. Out of nowhere, like I consider consolations, she writes, that he was old only a month, and he never saw me old. I always felt that we would never be ruined by age. I perhaps will be, but it no longer matters. There were sentences that they would truly get stuck in my memory. And that was a way of judging if they were right or not, because the Italian felt like it had this perfect balance. And if I found the balance, whatever it was, it's totally subjective, but if it sunk in somewhere, then I felt like it could work.
It sounds as though you've given it its poetry, because if you would have license to do that, to say crushed is the last word in a poem, whereas a copy editor would say, no, this is the wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we were talking before, so how the book is full of references to her early work, which is not contrived. I mean, it shows how her whole life was moving through her works of art, and at a certain moment, there's almost no distinction. And many of because when they first started seeing each other, her and Innocenzo, she was writing mostly poetry, she wasn't writing any prose. So you have these poems, and you actually can see on the page, I mean, they're her early work, and a lot of it is beautiful, but you can see that she is more poet in prose than in poetry. It's kind of startling. Yes.
I was thinking about some of the challenges of translating an author who's no longer alive and being context to author, and so what we were talking about 78. But so that led me to want to ask you, if you have dinner with Lalla Romano, what would you most want to ask her? About her life or her work, or what are the burning curiosities that you
I have a question. I don't know what I would ask her. I would ask about her interest in hands. Because it's just everywhere in the work, in this novel, as I said in the story that I also happened to translate, and yeah, I would want to know about that from someone who was a painter, and why. I mean, it's really interesting because in the story that I translated, to kind of give it away, but she decides that this man's hands are perfect, but then she discovers later that he makes shoes, and that this is very distressing to her, that he's not the man and he's not coming from the social class, the intellectual class that she assumed. So there's a sort of class, reading in her reading of hands as well, alongside, I think, a kind of purely aesthetic, perhaps even fetishistic relationship to the human hand.
But also, coming from her perspective as a painter and really seeing all of the arts as on a kind of a craft level, where you really use your hands. And that's really why she gave up painting. She said, you have to do it every day, like any real practical art form. And during the war, she couldn't get materials.
Yeah.
So that's what really drove her more to the written word. That's such a good question. Then I was thinking about what her answer would be. That I didn't think about what I would ask her. There's so many details. I mean, first I would show up with a list of like little details that I would want to ask her in the work. Like, what do you mean with this word here? I feel like there's such she has an amazing capacity, and I wonder if you grappled with this, Jhumpa, with the story translating The Lady. Where things seem so precise. But there often really is a kind of duplicity, of meaning, if not more than duplicity, but at least, different ways you could take something. And I've often grappled with the limits of English with that way, things really do feel sometimes like they have to be more precise in a literal way in English. What is this referring to? It's much easier to talk about abstractions, like this book gets fairly philosophical towards the end, where he is reaching death, and they have these almost conversations, and she has these reflections about death, about religion, about philosophy, and that was something really hard to grapple with in English, because it was hard to, there's a lightness in Italian. This is a problem going back to from when people started translating Dante, and describing why people are in hell, the different sins, the different. These are abstract concepts that English has always been kind of poor at describing, and if you use Latinate words, it elevates it, and it's hard to find that right register in Italian. So I would have so many little things. I would have definitely asked. The first novel I translated of hers called A Silence Shared, which is set during the Resistance. She was involved in the Resistance, but she never, and it's covered in the book, but after the early notes for the book, the early manuscript, she made the character, who was her alter ego, less and less personally involved. She knows partisans, but she doesn't do anything. She was not interested in like self-aggrandizement, and I would have asked, what were you doing? Like, what exactly was your involvement in the? Oh, and this was one of the most fascinating things when I was seeing her relatives. Her husband, Cenzo, he always worked in a bank. She found this artist in him, even though he did this, bourgeois life, like the Flaubert thing, like live as ordinary bourgeois in life, to be violent and extreme in your work. But they believe that he was going back and forth between Turin and Cuneo, during the war, bringing news and updates to the partisans hidden in the hills outside of Cuneo. This is something I would have asked her. This is not factual. This can't be stated as a fact. This is what her relatives think. And people intuited that in the book. It's not in the book, but people misread it, and believe he's a partisan. And the book, like their life, allows you to misinterpret it, because he might have actually been very directly involved. Sorry, long answer.
I think we have time for one more question.
If someone is new to her work, do you recommend starting with this book or starting with, where should one start?
I did. I would recommend this one, and then going backward. And what do we have in English at this point by Lalla?
So
we have
have
your
these
two,
and there's a translation from about 30 years ago of her book that's titled in English The Penumbra.
Right.
I think these are both great. I have my reservations about The Penumbra as a starting point. I think these are both great intros, but they come from, you could start from two polar ends. This is her most novelistic work. And so that makes it a bit easier. It's very, very poetic, the style, but she does, again, it's not her literal character, she has a kind of alter ego, whereas this is, if you're looking for more straightforward, diaristic in that sense, this is on that other opposite end. It's her most intimate personal work. And everything else is kind of somewhere in the middle. So I'd say it's good to start, she's an extreme author, why not start with one of the two extremes? This is another book of hers, which has not been translated, called Maria, and I just like the Italian edition because it has a painting of her. This was a maid that worked for her in Innocenzo.
Who's cited often in this book, in Farthest Seas. There are many references to Maria.
And a lot, actually part one ends with the first.
Is there citation of this novel?
The first line of the novel.
Yeah.
And it was kind of beautiful. This was her first novel, and the chapter, the section that traces the beginning of her life with Innocenzo, ending with their wedding and honeymoon, ends with the first line of her first novel. And it's hinting pretty directly that, there's something about their relationship being, officially becoming wed and married, is actually in many ways what leads to the birth of her as a novelist. I think. I don't know if it's pushing too far.
Thank you so much.